Thank you all for joining. So this is the second time I've done this, where we're kind of going through what the technology is. I've had a couple of sessions where we had people in the industry talking about how they're using different types of AI for different types of work. But once a quarter, I want to dig into what the actual technology is. So today, it's interesting. When I first wanted to do this, we didn't have quite the same number of announcements that we just got. So we'll be covering that at the end as well. So the agenda for today, we've only got an hour, and I've got kind of a lot to go through. I'm going to try to leave about 10 minutes at the end, and I'll stay around if people have any questions or are interested in digging in a little bit deeper. So we'll start with a quick recap of what we covered last quarter. There's a couple of terms I would like everyone to understand because they come up so much when we talk about generative AI. Then we're going to get into what generative AI actually is. Kind of want to dig into what these words mean and what these terms mean. Not going super deep. There's tons of stuff on the internet if you really want to go deep. This is more for folks that have another job and would like to just kind of know what some of these terms and concepts mean. We're going to talk about agents because I think agents are going to be the big story for the next year. In fact, some of what OpenAI just did is actually Sam Altman even said that this is the sort of on-ramp to agents. Then we'll talk a little bit about some work that I've been a part of to start thinking about how AI might actually replace tasks and aid with tasks. And we start with kind of a task breakdown. And the final point is I'm just going to quickly talk about some of the amazing AI announcements. Actually, it's been a pretty busy month. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Hugh Seaton. I'm the CEO of a startup called The Link. We use AI to make construction specs consumable. Also, obviously the host of the AI in Construction webinar, but also I've got a podcast called Constructed Futures. Wrote a book, hoping to write another book. Been the GM of Crosswalk at CSI, and actually I'm a member of the CSI Standard Steering Committee. So I keep busy. AI has been a passion of mine for over a decade, and I find that the more we understand about what these concepts and terms mean, the more the creativity of sort of people doing their jobs comes out. So that's the goal here. So a quick recap of what I talked about last time. So the first one of these in Q3 was really starting to set a baseline of what AI even is, what types of AI there are. And I started with the definition because I have rarely heard one. And I want you to keep in mind that it's still software. We're not comparing it to people, even though there's a temptation to do so. It can do things without explicit programming. That's one of the things that makes it unique, usually involving some type of prediction. And that term starts to get a little bit less useful when you get as complex as generative AI. But at its heart, that's actually a lot of what's going on. A key takeaway, I want to make a bumper sticker out of this, but AI is math, it's not magic. Knowing that helps us to kind of think about why it fails sometimes and why it succeeds the way it does. Final point, and this was actually the beginning of what I talked about last time, is we can usefully think of AI as three waves. In the 70s and 80s, there was expert systems, otherwise known as symbolic logic. A lot of that's kind of been absorbed just into normal software. In around 2011, there was a resurgence of deep learning. The idea had been around a little while, but a team from University of Toronto really made it work for the first time. And that's why a lot of us have been hearing about AI, as I say, for up to a decade. And the final kind of wave that we're in the middle of right now started in 2017 with a big paper, but we really started hearing about it last year when OpenAI announced ChatGPT. And that's obviously why you're all spending some of your afternoon with me here. We're going to talk about wave 3 the most today. The last one in Q3 is available on YouTube, and I talk about deep learning a lot more. There's a ton of deep learning out there still, it's worth noting. In fact, more things are in production that are deep learning, although that's changing pretty fast. So that's sort of a quick recap of what we talked about last time. So today, guys, I'm going to go through a lot of terms and a lot of concepts, mostly because I want you to have a picture of what these tools are doing under the hood. They're deep wells. There's a lot, you could spend a lot of time on this. And at the end, I'm going to suggest everybody who wants to dive deeper, go look at deeplearning.ai. I'll remind you of that again later. They've got a bunch of 1-hour courses that are free that just kind of dig into each of the pieces that I'm talking about here. But this is really for folks that would like to hear a little bit about this, but maybe don't want to spend too much of your time studying. So first, I want to talk about a concept that's really important, and it's what makes a lot of certainly natural language processing work, including large language models. And that's the idea of a vector. Now, the net is that even though it looks like they do, computers, whether it's AI or not, they can't read. You have to turn what they do into numbers. I mentioned before, it's math, not magic. So what they call that is a vector, and it's just a sequence of numbers, or an array, as we say here. So this is an idea, or kind of an example that I grabbed, and actually all this stuff is sourced, of what a vector looks like. And what's important about that is vectors aren't random. They're just not numbers that you give it. It's what they call an embedding model. And the point here is that the vector is assigned to words or parts of words, otherwise known as tokens, which we'll get into in a second, based on what it thinks the meaning of that word is. And the reason that matters is it allows the computer, or allows the AI system rather, to understand, because vectors are in a database, they're otherwise known as embedded in a database. They can be analyzed by how similar they are, and a lot of the stuff that we're now taking for granted about what AI can do is made possible not just because the model is so great, but because the embedding that happens first is also really good. We're going to get into embedding just a little bit more. So as I mentioned, it's a key part of all natural language processing. These models, there isn't just one. They can be specialized, they can be better, they can be worse, they can be bigger, they can be smaller, they can be faster, they can be slower, just like anything else. And a lot of this will drive the quality of the actual application, and how well the model performs based on how well the embedding works. Now, the next concept that I want you guys to understand is what gets embedded isn't always an actual word. Sometimes it's a token. And for those of you who've been playing around with or working with ChatGPT or really any of the LLMs, you've probably heard the term token a lot. And the thing about a token is it's a unit of analysis that AI technology can use. And it didn't start with AI. This idea of tokens has been around for a long, long time. And right now, the way something gets embedded, part of what the embedding system is doing is choosing what should be a token versus not. Is it a whole word? Is it part of a word? Is it a single letter, which is a little rare, but sometimes. So again, they're what generative AI teams use to describe the capacity of models. So you're hearing this number. I think one of the big things that OpenAI, one of the things that OpenAI announced is that they were able to accept dramatically more tokens than used to be true. Well, this gives you an idea of what that means. You can't think of tokens as necessarily being words. So it isn't 128,000 words. It's actually 300-page book is closer to 60 or 70,000 words. But it gives you an idea that per word, you might have one to 1.5 tokens. So those are some terms that I wanted people to understand, because they're really central to your understanding of what LLMs do and what their capacities are and what you're able to do with them. So some takeaways here, and I'll stop along the way to do this, so you kind of focus on what I think is a good thing to walk away with. Vector databases, they're just databases where words and other concepts are stored as vectors, as the name kind of implies. Embedding is the process of converting content into vectors for storage in a vector database. So worth knowing that it isn't just a model, it's also what you're using to feed the model and store in a database. Point we'll get to in just a second. So how does generative AI work? How does a transformer work? So last time I mentioned, and you probably have heard now more times than you want to, that a lot of this kicked off with a Google paper in 2017 called "Attention is All You Need." And the point of that was they started saying, look, instead of just giving AI reams and reams and reams of labeled data, why don't we teach it how to fill in blanks? And the way they do that is by masking. So let's say you've got a sentence, or you've got graphics, or you've got something like that, something else. They'll mask part of it and train the system to predict what was missing. Now that's pretty cool when it's, a smaller model, maybe it'll figure out a word or two. But these models that are in there, many billions of parameters, they're just massive. are actually able to generalize that to be able to create, reams and reams of content. So the idea of masking is sort of the heart of how a lot of this works, certainly on the training side, and it helps you to understand why is it that AI, or that generative AI, will make things up when it doesn't know the answer, what we used to call hallucinations. And that's because it's been trained to fill in blanks. And if it doesn't know the answer, it's going to come up with an answer that is plausible, because that, again, that's the fundamental mechanism of what transformer models do, is they fill in blanks. So, as I kind of have said here, I was getting ahead of myself. That's why prompts work, because a prompt is basically giving it a blank. It's giving it a space. It's saying, answer this question because that's what's missing. It doesn't always seem that way when you write something like, write me a short essay about codfish, but that's what it reads it as, is that you've asked it to fill in a pretty lengthy blank. So it's important, as I mentioned, to remember that generative AI is filling in blanks. But the other thing that I think everyone is still missing is that it's intended for and trained for interaction. So one of the problems we often have is that we'll give it a prompt and think it's like Google, where I've asked it the question, and if it doesn't give me the answer I want, it must be broken. When the reality is you can ask it again. If it doesn't give you what you want, the whole point is to think of it as an interaction. Just like if you were talking to a person who didn't quite understand your question, you would ask them the question, and you'd restate the question and ask it again. So another takeaway might be that as you're dealing with all these new products and ChatGPT and so on, think about it not as a one-off, it answered well or it didn't answer well, but rather you're talking to something that can look at the same question more than one way and try to ask it more than once. Everybody now has some Copilot or AI or whatever, whether it's, we'll talk about that later also, whether it's Autodesk or Procore, and everybody's been announcing things. So it's worth keeping in mind that you'll get more out of it if you think of it conversationally rather than just a call and response like Google is. And I spoke to this a second ago. AI is trained to fill in the blanks. If it knows the answer, it's going to tell you. And we're getting better at stopping it from answering if it doesn't know. But that was some of why. So again, models are getting trained not to do this. There's a thing we'll talk about in a moment called retrieval augmented generation, which gives extra knowledge to the system, which often is another way of helping with hallucinations. And quite frankly, RAG, as we call it, is also a really good way to expand the power of a model, because you're giving it access to information that you maybe didn't train it on, which makes it more flexible and more powerful, as I say. So the reason why embedding is important for you to have some understanding of is, like I say, this is a lot to look at, so bear with me. But on the left-hand side of this architecture, you can see it's the embedding model, right? And there's a bunch going on in there, but the point is it's embedding the input. Then it goes into, on the right-hand side, this is going back and forth to the model to give you answers. So the key point here is that it's a two-part system. How you embed is just, anyway, it's very important. And then how the model responds is what you're actually there for. So what can you do with this? Like, everyone is familiar with the text models, with ChatGPT and some of its kind of versions, and some of you probably are using Anthropic's Claude, but there's more going on than that. Some things that are worth knowing is there are code models. Some of you may have heard GitHub Copilot, Amazon's got Code Whisperer. Interestingly, I hear people talk about using these models in pretty cool ways, doing things that developers hate doing. And I think there's an analogy to be drawn there. Specifically, I've heard a number of people using GitHub Copilot and some of the other code models to comment on code. And for those of you who haven't dealt with code very much, the point of that is when you write a bunch of code, you want to comment on it so someone who looks at it later knows what it's doing. Well, that's like the most boring kind of documentation. Yeah, people do it, but they don't love it. Being able to automate that is fantastic. Interestingly, for number 3, we're running out of data. I don't know if you guys have come across that, but there's so much data being used to train some of these that we now have to come up with ways of creating synthetic data, which is another model. Image models, some of you may have worked with DALL-E 3, Stable Diffusion's another good one. I don't hear about audio and video as much, but they're out there and they work. They're just a little bit more work to work with them. So and again, I'm marching forward pretty fast because I want to make sure there's time at the end. We've talked about large language models, also known as foundation models. What has happened over the last month and a half is we started shifting from models that really only do one thing to models that do a number of things, otherwise known as multimodal models. And the mode, of course, is what sense is being used, or what mode of communication is being used. So that's actually really exciting because it means that you can ask one model to compare different things, to look at like a drawing versus a spec, or a drawing versus some notes. Really exciting. I think there's still some work to be done to productize this, but I think this is going to be the future of what we see as opposed to pure play models. It's just they're getting so good. You may not use every mode every time you use it, but you're going to get used to having multimodal models. So now we get into the part that matters if you're looking to grow your own or adapt your own model. And in fact, some of this has already been, what I'm about to describe has already been kind of baked into some of the tools that you can get from OpenAI as well as AWS and some others. So I want to talk about three components to what makes a large language model, really any generative AI model, work. There's the data that you're pointing it at. There's the embedding model I talked about a moment ago, and then there's the model itself. There's some things you can do for each of these. Data, look, we've been hearing about structuring your data since AI in the 2010s. That's still true. It's less necessary for generative AI. It's a lot more forgiving of less structured data. But that said, it's going to be more reliable if the data is structured better. Also, it's going to be reliable if you give it a map of where to find data, especially if you've got a lot of data that it's going through. The other thing is, it isn't always better to give it a lot. One of the interesting things I'll talk about in a moment is when OpenAI made their context window, and we'll talk about what that means in a sec, but when they made it possible for you to pass in 128,000 tokens, it turns out that there were some accuracy issues based on how long it is. So, a good rule of thumb with really anything, but certainly with AI, is if you can make the problem smaller, it will work better. That's just a general point. I think that's true for people too, but in AI, it's a thing that I think we don't always consider, is that if I can make this problem smaller, shorter, easier, it's going to be more reliable, especially if you're having to do repeated tasks. Sometimes you can break the problem into pieces, which is a pretty common tactic. The next part is the embedding model. Is you want to make sure you're choosing the right embedding model, and this is where an expert's going to help you. But also, you can fine-tune an embedding model just like you can fine-tune the main model. And that's where the action often is in the model itself. So fine-tuning a model you can do that a number of different ways. At the link, what we wound up doing is asking it a bunch of questions and training it on what a good answer would look like. And it was like 200 or 300 questions, so it's not a credible amount. The other thing that is increasingly possible is to actually grow your own model. If anybody had said that 8 months ago, it would have seemed weird, but we're learning how to make models much smaller that can do just the thing you need, instead of being, GPT-4 that's massive and really expensive to train and does more than you need it to do. So you're finding people that look at whether they want to grow a model that's, nowhere near as big, but also can really only do what you've asked it to do. The benefit of that, of course, is that you own the model, you own the data, and you control where it goes. And I think you're going to find an increasingly diverse set of solutions for how people make generative AI work for them and their business. A second ago, and I want to remind everybody, this is all going to be recorded, or it is recorded, so you can look at this again afterwards. The next thing is when you're thinking about data, the concept that comes up a lot is what they call a context window, and that's how much information you can pass in with the question. So sometimes you don't want to just ask the question, you want to give it some documents. Then it'll embed it, and then it'll predict the response. The thing is, the model's ability to do this is not infinite. So they have this thing called a context window, as I mentioned. This is the length of the question, the information you pass in, and the answer. So when you think about, before, it was like 8,000 tokens, and it was actually quite constraining. That's why Altman mentioned that a lot of people were annoyed, and that's why they kind of over-indexed and made it so big. That's really a big increase from where they were. I mentioned a second ago that there's some evidence that GPT-4 right now isn't as good at the full 128,000 tokens. It's better at the beginning and at the end. In the middle, the understanding and ability to retrieve and work on it is not quite as effective as it is in the beginning and end. This is the sort of thing that they will fix, that they'll tune it and figure out how to get it better. But it just speaks to the fact that in the beginning, a lot of these things are wonderful in a demo, but not so great at some of the edge cases. And I think this is an example. So a lot of you will have heard this term retrieval augmented generation, RAG. It's an AI framework. It's a way of improving the quality of what your LLM generates by grounding the model, not in what it remembers, but in actual external source of knowledge that you connect it to. It supplements the internal representation of information, to put it in a particularly dry IBM way. Two big benefits of this. One is it as I mentioned, it ensures that model has access to what you want it to be looking at, the most current reliable facts, but also it ensures that users have access to the model's sources. This is a big deal. It's nice to know that you're looking at the ground truth documents, whether it's a contract or a specification or a standard, whatever it is, or a set of RFIs, so that you can check for accuracy and learn to trust it. I think this is really important, not just for technologists, but for users to be able to kind of look at something and see, yes, I trust this now. It keeps coming up with things that are correct. There are, however, some concerns. So in fact, on some of the back and forth with the invite, there was somebody asked a question about this, hold on one second. That security, that if you give access to your documents to the AI model, sometimes there have been instances where people can convince it to let them download the original files. Now, if this is internal to a contractor or a company, that's less an issue. But if you're having customers or users or people that are outside of your kind of company or your trusted circle, the ability to download the original files is a concern. Now, this is getting addressed. All this stuff gets addressed, but it's nevertheless something to be aware of. Also, do the access documents actually help with the question? So it's important to make sure that you're pointing things at the right information and there isn't too much there. The other thing is, depending on the setup, you've added another access layer. You've added another thing for the model to do. So sometimes it can make the response time slow. And the thing is, we have gotten so used to immediate software that 30 seconds is an eternity if you're watching something do something. So it's just worth noting that RAG will have that effect, depending on how you set things up and how big the document it's referencing is. So as we're talking about all this, I mentioned embedding quality a little bit before, and I want to touch on it one more time. Vector embedding, it's not a standard process. I mean, the way it works is pretty standard, but the actual entity that does it, the software that does it, there are a number of models out there that will do it for you. They'll use different embeddings. You really want to use the same embedding that your actual LLM has been trained on, or your foundation model has been trained on. Some are better than others. Some will work better for some use cases than others. And there's another factor I didn't point out here, and that is they're also not all the same price. So OpenAI just dropped a lot of their costs because they were suffering from competition because other people were kind of migrating to other solutions. But the net is there's a lot to think about with embedding quality, the choice of embedding solution you use. So similarly, and hopefully you're starting to get the picture that there's a lot of choice that can be made out there. There's different models, there's different embeddings. You can use RAG, you can use fine tuning. So different models are going to be different quality and different power and different cost. Just OpenAI has, was it 7 there that I just grabbed from their website. There's actually subdivisions even within this. There's the GPT 3.5 has a couple of different ones, depending on how you access it. Meta has Llama 2 and 3, excuse me. There's Stable Diffusion, there's Mistral, there's a lot of others. So it's worth knowing that yeah, we hear about OpenAI the most because they're the pioneers and they're pushing the envelope, but there's a lot of other choices out there, some of which might either be more cost effective, be more security conscious, or more in line with what your company wants. One of the great things I think Microsoft is doing is wrapping the Azure security and Azure kind of, experience with being a cloud provider around a lot of these models. I think that's a really important thing that enterprises are going to appreciate, is that they already trust that Azure will keep their data safe and will help with cybersecurity. Having that as the way to access these things is just another layer of reassurance and quite frankly, functionality. AWS has done something similar with their framework called Bedrock, where they surround whatever model you want to use with different tooling so that it will do different things that you need it to do and connect and so on. So that's a really important point too, is not just the model you select, but the way you're accessing it and built around it all matter. And the final one I mentioned already is you train your own. It is possible to do this. Most uses, you don't need this, certainly not this early. If you do, I would strongly recommend that you define the scope narrowly. I mentioned before that, and even last in Q3, the more narrow the more narrow the role you want it to play and the tasks you want it to answer, the less data you're going to need and the less of a model you're going to need. So getting enough data is really hard if you've got too broad a set of questions. So if you can define it more narrowly, you're going to do better. Then you got to select the right model architecture. Most of it, of course, it's going to be a transformer, but there's some choices to be made. Then you're going to train it. It's not going to work as much as you want. You're going to train it more. And eventually you get something that is special, that works just for what you need it to do, which is the reason people will do this, is it can wind up being actually, a competitive advantage. I talked before about fine-tuning. Unlike growing your own, fine-tuning is tweaking the model's behavior. It's sharpening what it can do. This takes a lot less data than you think. I mentioned that we got a long way with about 200 and change questions. We did question answer pairs and actually told the model what it should have answered, not just what it did answer. So you're tuning it to be closer to what you want it to do. And they're really good at listening to this and learning from it. So we've gone through a lot. I'm smoking through this kind of fast. Thank you for all of you that are hanging out. The way to make a product. So transformers were invented in 2017. Why did ChatGPT take 5 years to come out? And the answer is they innovated something that made them useful. And by that, I mean GPTs before ChatGPT were powerful models that weren't as controllable. They would produce good and bad. And what they created is something called reinforcement learning with human feedback. Basically, they've got people rating what comes out of it. Really effective way to make GPTs into useful tools, and something that I think we're going to find companies do on their own as well. It's very easy to find partners that will help you with this. It's going to be essential for real use in construction, where people are busy and they don't really have the time to second guess what the model is telling them. If you think about construction as a massive overlapping maze of information, you need to train the AI what to look for and how to summarize it. And reinforcement learning with human feedback is a good way to do that, in addition to fine-tuning. The final piece in this sort of sequence here is LangChain. Some of you may have heard this term. This was a really early framework that allows you to connect your model to different things. It comes with intake, embedding a model, the LLM, the output itself, even some RAG connections. So it winds up being a fast way to get something up and in production. And most people that aren't OpenAI that are making something are using LangChain. So it really accelerated the practical use of LLMs this year by providing this framework and way for people to stand things up pretty quickly. It doesn't, I say it makes the product easy, relatively easy. It still takes a lot of work and people to know the right places to go. So the next thing I want to talk about is agents. So if you think about what we've talked about so far and what most people are using, a chatbot doesn't do anything. It just answers a question. But what if you connect it to, Zapier, which you probably have heard of. If not, now you have. Zapier is an integration engine that's been around for a while that allows software to easily connect with things and do things. It was one of the early integrations OpenAI did. And if you think about, if you're telling a model, go search the web and bring me back something, it's actually acting in the world. And that speaks to the beginning of what might be an agent. So let's differentiate the three things here. So if you think about a model, it's the core program trained on data that processes information and then responds. It's about input and output. A chatbot is an interface to a model that organizes the input and output for a text-based interaction. It's about prompt and answer, or you could say question and answer. An agent is a system that uses a model to pursue a set of goals. And this is important. If you think about people that work on your team or you worked with, we're usually pursuing some goal or another and then acting in the world. This is about goal and result. And it's a really different paradigm for what AI can do for us. You can think of an agent as something that can sense the world. So this could be, you're talking to it. It's got some level of input. It has a goal-based model of the world. So this is what I want to get to. It can compare what it senses in the world to what it wants the world to be, like the difference between its goal and what it's seeing. It can create an action plan to change the world. Now, this is going to be a simple action plan. It's not going to be a Sun Tzu strategy here. But nevertheless, it's going to say, I need to do this, this, and this to get there. And then it'll have the ability to act in the world, sometimes called actuators. It should also be able to be capable of multi-step planning because most things take more than one step. Critically, it's going to have to be capable of stopping. What we don't want is these things to just run off the rails, so to speak, and actually have clear guardrails. The benefits of agents, and I'm telling you this because 2024, I think you're going to hear about agents an awful lot. And the point is they can be left alone to do tasks and bring a human back the results, then figure out how to get things completed within limits, obviously. Can produce real work, not just answers. They can speak to each other and complement each other. So you don't necessarily only have one agent. You can have a set of agents that are doing narrow tasks that come together and give you a completed result. You can scale by replicating to handle large workloads. The interesting thing here is if for some reason you have an awful lot for the agent to work on, you can multiply it and have 15 agents doing it instead of just one, and then scale it back down when you're finished. This is something we learned from software. The danger is that we'll trust their outputs, and this is what people will say is the general danger of AI, is that we're going to trust the outputs more than we should. Time-pressed managers aren't going to check the work that the agent produces. I mean, this happens when you hire people, and sometimes you don't check their work as much as you might. They can get access to systems that answer a question, and then we forget to remove that access, and down the road, something weird happens. In pursuit of a goal, they may flood resources to get answers, whether inputs or other requirements. The point is, they don't have world knowledge, they don't have common sense. So if we're not careful with how we use them, they may go run amok a little bit. The other thing that we don't know that this is true, but I have a suspicion is that they'll be interesting additions to a team, such that they may have an impact on morale. So they can and will be used to catch errors and inconsistencies, and that can be depressing. They'll increasingly be part of a team, but they're not a conscious one. So they're not going to be good working with others, except if you think of them as an agent versus a human. They're going to remain obtuse about how they're asked to do things. As opposed to people who think a little bit more clearly. We're going to give them adequate guardrails or they'll cause trouble. And I think this is why, I know this is why OpenAI did not start with agents so early, that what they created, as we'll see in a moment, are some things that can become agents, but they're not there yet. The other thing that's going to be critical is stopping rules. This is the old sorcerer's apprentice idea, is that once it gets going, if it's not told to stop, it might keep doing things. And sometimes that's going to be suboptimal, shall we say. And again, the point here is that they shouldn't need supervision all the time. Otherwise, you haven't saved enough time. Status is LangChain and others have frameworks that you can create limited agents. OpenAI GPTs can combine with Zapier and other integrations, and you can make, again, some limited agents. I think you're going to see that GPT and the assistants, so for those of you who are familiar with what OpenAI just announced, he explicitly said there's steps to get to agents. I want to take a kind of break here, not really a break, but now we're going to shift gears and talk about how we can apply AI tools to actual work. And the starting point for that is, what do we do over and over? What are repetitive tasks that can be automated? I felt so strongly about repetitive tasks, I capitalized it. What should we what would we train a smart but narrow intern to do? A nice analogy is if you had someone who was smart, who really was really book smart, but really not really street stupid. I don't know if you can say that anymore, but you get my point. What would you ask them to do? What would you trust them with? You trust them with things that are repetitive, that are document heavy, that require knowledge, but not necessarily kind of common sense and understanding. AI is like that, but way, way worse than a human would ever be. So here are three steps on the way to thinking about this. And for those of you who tuned in 2 months ago, some of this comes from what I did with Don Speedy, who's a senior field leader on the West Coast. The first thing you're going to want to do is analyze the job. Now, Don went in and actually went across a bunch of different parts of a process. You can't even read this. I apologize for that, except that I really wanted to illustrate a point. He broke apart the tasks related to something and said how much of this is a high level of time or effort and how much of it is low as a start to analyze this. Zooming in, you can see as he's looking at these different pieces, there's tons of repetition, tons of the same thing. So how do we use that to say, okay, these are the areas where we think AI can help? And once you figured that out, you got to ask yourself, great, what can the tools do? Right? I've figured out what I want to aim at. What am I aiming with? So some first thoughts here is and this is a term you're going to hear a lot, is no more blank sheets of paper. Like, you don't have to start from zero anymore. It can create drafts of things, whether it's drafting an RFI or whether it's a response or various other things that we find ourselves writing and typing. Just that alone is a big deal. But also minimizing tedious search and summarizing. So if you're looking for something, it's a great way to not only find what you were looking for, but summarize it. Whether that's everything from specs, obviously near and dear to my heart, but RFIs, change orders, communications, who said what did that, sometimes what did that mean? Things like lessons learned. And this is just me talking in abstract. As people actually start to use this, you're going to see this list grow. Speeding up job analysis is another one. So extracting plans, extracting spec information. There's a thing called entity extraction that LLMs are good at, where they're pulling the information you want from context. And that's what people wind up doing in construction all the time, and can summarize it. The interesting thing is all of these models are actually able to, well, not all of them, but very often they're able to create a table for you or a bulleted list or whatever it is you need, which is great. So instead of just giving you a lump of text, it's actually going to format it in a way you can use it. Also, avoid guessing about terms or requirements. This comes down to the whole finding things. Quickly referencing contract details, referencing them against something else. Obviously, some of you have heard about this with Document Crunch and Black Boiler and some others. The final part is applying tools to tasks. So folks, we've got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to go through some of the announcements that have come up. Starting with OpenAI Dev Day, we'll talk about Microsoft and then Procore and Autodesk. And I'm wide open to people talking about any of this if you were at some of these events. The interesting thing about OpenAI is they had their first developer conference. For those of you who aren't aware, that's really common for Silicon Valley software companies. They want to get developers excited, so they go build things on their product, people use it, and they make more money. So the first thing is they announced the much bigger context windows that I mentioned earlier. The models there's a GPT-4 Turbo, I believe they call it, that's just faster and more capable. So they keep growing and adding to these models. A lot of that is actually just training them and tuning them as opposed to making them bigger per se. They came out with something called assistants, and this is a really interesting idea. Basically, what they've done, for those of you who know software, they've made a software development kit. They don't call it that, but that's kind of what it is, that allows you to add an assistant to really any product. So for those of you who are growing or have built or are working on in-house software at the company you work, this is something you might look at, is do we want to actually include this as an easy way to access certain types of information and so on. The other one that's really cool is GPTs. And now this one is interesting because what it allows you to do is create to create your own chatbot without any code. And this is what it looks like. So I actually created one, and it takes a little bit more thinking than just plugging stuff in, but it's remarkably easy to get something actually pretty good working. So what you're seeing here is you need to be a GPT Plus member, but that's $20 a month. What you're able to do is tell it what you want in pretty clear English. This is where you're probably going to play around a little bit, because at first it might or might not do what you want, but I encourage you to play around in here because it's listening and it will respond based on what you say in here. So you can restate it maybe and it will work a little better. Then you're going to give it the conversation starters are those sort of down here. You might have it already have a question for you, so people kind of know what to ask the chatbot. That's a little bit of a secret that lots of people that work with chatbots will do, is give you an idea of what kind of questions you can ask it. That's where you would enter that. Knowledge is really interesting. This is where you can upload files, whether it's guides, it's a safety guide, it's product guide, something like that, that the system can then use to answer people's questions. Finally, as we get towards the bottom, you get a little closer to the agent idea. So you can click on web browsing, you can click on DALL-E image generation, which is pretty cool. And then code interpreter is more than just code. It makes it sound like it's looking at HTML or something, but actually this is the function that allows it to analyze data and do some really interesting stuff. And the final part is creating a new action. And here's where you can connect it to different things. Frankly, I haven't dug into that yet as much as I'd like. But across all of these, their vision is for people that are not developers to be able to create little helpers that can help them with things that they do a lot, or that a coworker does a lot, or you name the use case. But the point is, it's a no-code solution that I encourage everybody to play with a little bit, and because it allows you to think in terms of what it would be like if we had these as part of our daily life and daily work. And again, it's pretty low cost. Microsoft also had their Ignite. Now, you guys probably know OpenAI is, I think, half owned by Microsoft. So there's a huge connection between the two of them. A lot of the models that Microsoft is talking about are actually OpenAI models that they've surrounded with Azure and other work. They've announced a thing called Copilot Studio, which is also a no-code AI solution. It's thought of as an extension of 365 Copilot. Then you can tailor Copilot's automation flow, so on. So they're obviously a lot more enterprise and business oriented in how they've done this, but it's pretty good stuff. They've got a personalized touch for the Copilot, so it enhances the interactivity, and especially in team meetings. So yet again, Microsoft really doubling down on Teams. There's an AI studio for model configuration. That's a little more on the code heavy side. The final part that I thought was interesting is AI-powered background decoration for Microsoft Teams. I haven't used that yet. I'm sure all sorts of hilarity will ensue. A lot of you are aware of how actually Microsoft Copilot was integrated into Procore. I have not used that myself. I think it's a really interesting way of bringing two things together. Super exciting. I think they announced it in October, so a lot of people are still figuring out quite what that means. The key features that they talk about anyway is that you can provide answers to questions the teams ask in search, better search results, capabilities to complete your next task. So a lot of this here is what I mentioned before about never a white sheet of paper or blank sheet of paper again, is it helps you in your work by presenting things, by suggesting things, and so on, which is really exciting. I think there's going to be more functionality than that, but that's what I'm hearing right now. Autodesk, being the creative powerhouse that they are, decided to call it Autodesk AI with some great graphics. This one, classic Autodesk, there's a ton in here that does different things, and I don't have the time to dig in too much, but a lot of this boils down, I think, to, again, giving you some either summaries or early drafts of what you might want to write. Things like risk review, though, is really exciting. Automated submittal logs, which obviously I think is a good idea. Suggested submittals, so on and so forth. Really exciting what they're doing. So across the board, the key point here is that AI is now part of almost every software you use. So I really appreciate your having joined me here. That is most of what I want to talk about right now. So we're in the early stages of what really is a true revolution. The term iPhone moment has come out a bunch of times where people are talking about the moment when how we fundamentally interact with information changed. In the case of the iPhone, it took a couple of years in an app store and some other things. I think this is happening an awful lot faster. And I think you're going to look back in 3 years and say, yeah, that's a lot like how the iPhone was. So my suggestion is go try these things out. Try to build an understanding of not only how GPTs work, but how you might work with them. Because what we're not hearing enough of is the human side of this. Ultimately, technology succeeds or fails based on how much humans use it and how much value humans get out of it. Technology on its own does not create productivity. Technology plus process creates productivity. So the more you can get in here and learn, the better you're going to be as this becomes more and more a part of everyday work. I said before, and I'll just mention again, deeplearning.ai was founded by the co-founder of, I'm blanking on it now, but one of the online course companies. And really good work in there. Guy's name is Andrew Ang, and he's been the head of AI pretty much everywhere. Really good stuff. Take some short courses. You can ignore the code, just listen to the lecture, and it takes you about 45 minutes because I tend to listen to it faster than they record it. And obviously reach out to me if you'd like to discuss any of what we've talked about today. So folks, I went through that kind of quick, probably faster than maybe I intended. So we got about 15 minutes. Would love to answer any questions. Thank you, Scott. Guys, if you want to type something in or even just unmute yourself, feel free to ask a question because this is an exciting thing and we're all learning from each other. So for Dennis and others who joined late, yes, I wanted to start on time, but it will be recorded. I will post it on LinkedIn a bunch of times. So it's being recorded right now, excuse me. I actually did the summary as well. So we'll see how well the summary comes out. So yeah, you'll be able to see all this in a day or two. Thank you, Aaron.
Hello.
Hello.
Hey, a quick question. Thank you for the presentation. It was really wonderful. In terms of training a GPT for yourself, let's say, for example, for the data that I've collected over certain years, can I input that data? Like, for example, the GPTs that you could create using OpenAI, can I put that data in and kind of like ask questions from that data? Is that something that? No?
Yeah, no, that's actually what it's for. That kind of thing is what form is the data in? Can you export it as a CSV or actually a PDF?
CSV or a text file, yeah, it would be.
That'd be fine. I think the better the formatting, probably the better it'll perform. But I think that's a great idea. And just jump in and give it a shot. There's two ways that you might consider that. One of them is if you look at, let's see if I can go back up. Don't stop. Yeah, there we go. One way is the knowledge where you might upload the information and just ask questions. Another way of doing it, though, would be to upload what you want the data to look like or what you want an analysis to look like. And up here, say, when I give you data, analyze it like the example. So you can try either way. That's called one shot or multiple shot questions where you give it an example. That's actually kind of a term of art. But that might be an interesting way. I would try both because it's free. It's like, if you don't like it, you delete it and just do it again. So they made it super easy for you to experiment.
I get it. And quick thing on this GPTs, does the files that I upload, does it become public or is it still private to me?
It should be, it's private to you.
Okay.
I would double check if you are in as a ChatGPT user. I believe they've made everything private now, but double check that. There's a question about enterprise versus non-enterprise, but that's easy to find out. Like I didn't actually think to ask that question when I was kind of researching for this, but you should be able to Google that question really quickly.
Okay, great, great.
It looks like Alper has answered that question, actually, private to you
Yeah,
and OpenAI. Yeah.
that's awesome. That's awesome. And can I connect these GPTs to Zapier or any like for example Zapier or make.com or something like that?
That's
Is
what
that
the Yeah, that's what the create new action is meant to be for. And Zapier's, they're really doing a lot with Zapier. So I would assume that that's where it is. Yes.
awesome? Awesome. No, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Hugh. This is
And,
great information.
I appreciate it. And I think Zoe is asking a question.
Yes. Hey, Hugh. First of all, thank you for the great presentation. I think you dropped a whole lot of gems. I did have a question, just going back, that kind of tipped me off regarding the agents and everything, but I'm curious to know your point of view in terms of AI's adoption amongst kind of smaller businesses that are not at the enterprise level. Do you think that kind of agents and these smaller single task models are going to be the kind of low risk, very easy interaction entry point for our industry that is needing to grow, and especially on the small business side, or kind of what you're seeing on that side?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think that Microsoft, and to a lesser extent Procore, if you're talking about smaller companies, but Microsoft 360 was a Copilot 365. Anyway, the point is they've made it really accessible for anyone who's got a Windows 365 account. So I think that's going to be what drives a lot of adoption, is that Microsoft will make these things part of how you do what you do anyway. So if you're in Excel, you're going to have access to an Excel GPT or whatever they're going to call it. So it'll do things for you. So I think the answer is it also really depends on the person. Some people will say, I want to go figure this out, and others will say, I would like to also, but I don't have time today. So I think it'll be a personal thing as much as a company thing. You know, you imagine a big general contractor, people are just as busy as they are in a small one. They may be doing slightly different things, but I think that it really is dependent on the person whether they want to adopt this or not. So I don't know. I think the thing that makes me really positive about adoption is that it's in Microsoft, where everything else is in Microsoft. If it weren't, it would be, you know, like a lot of other technologies where it'll come when it comes. But because people are already doing all of their work in some Office product or another, and it's all being integrated in there, I think we're just going to get used to having AI finish sentences for us, write for us, write drafts for us, and so on. And we're going to start thinking differently. And I like that, because it means you're going to be often thinking, you're not going to get caught in the words, but you're going to be spending time on the meaning.
Cool. Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you, man. And also, in the middle of your presentation, I got home and actually your book just arrived. So I'm very excited to dive into that.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you. That's great.
Hugh, what's the name of your book?
It's called the Construction Technology Handbook.
Great, great.
And that's the book is kind of why I do this too, is two reasons. One is I don't like it when people use words without defining them. So I've done a lot in my life to just do a webinar or something to just define what these terms are, because I live in this stuff and not everyone else does. The book does a lot of that. The other thing is you learn about things by talking about them.
Is the Construction Technology Handbook available like on Amazon, or do we have to order that direct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. No, I don't handle it.
Right.
And then the last thing you want is me shipping things to you.
Yeah. What I thought was really good about your presentation is also that research that was done where somebody was analyzing all the workflows that are associated with a typical, let's say, construction professional. Is that something that you are spearheading, is trying to, like, for instance, let's say procurement, let's say you're in a metropolitan area like Seattle, you only want to know suppliers that are within, let's say, 300 miles of Seattle in the way of procuring. So you want to build a training of your sort of automated functions so that you're demographically and geographically sort of, you know, you're not getting data from outside of that area. So that's where the big leverage is, I think, in speeding up because for construction people, procurement's huge, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
how do you go about, adopting something like Microsoft 365 Copilot in Excel? Sure, fine, finishing sentences, but the real big sort of productivity hacks are into these bigger, more faster, like, okay, I want windows, aluminum windows, or window wall systems, or curtain wall systems. Give me all suppliers that are within 300 miles of my project.
Yeah,
So how do you train that?
I think that there's probably a couple of steps in that one. And one of the things, Stefan, that you remind me of that I didn't mention, I don't think as much, is once you have an agent that you've trained to do something, and I'll get into how in a second, it'll do things that you would never have a human do. Like you might say, I want you every night to go and check the websites, or even make a phone call to make sure that they're open or that they have something. Like you could imagine, the checking and all the tedious crap that you would never pay someone to do, suddenly you can have it do. Going and looking if they have some sort of an inventory that you can access, whether it's an API or whatever, you can have it continually going to check and update stuff. Like I said, you'd never have a person do. The way I think you would train what you're talking about, it really would depend on the thing you're doing. But let's just say you're talking about Windows in Seattle, for the lack of a better word. You probably want to let it know, like whether it's with RAG I mentioned before, is probably the main way you do this. You give it access to the list of suppliers that you know about, and then maybe have it do a web search for other suppliers and limit it and say, I only want things that are within 300 miles of Seattle, whatever the geography you're talking about. But these are things you can just tell it to do, and then when it comes back, if it's not quite what you want, you tweak how you asked it and have it do it again. That makes sense?
It does.
The other element I would say is the quality of how well something like that might work is going to depend a little bit on its access to information. So if it's a big, if it's a big distributor that has an API and has the ability for you to kind of check things, as presumably you've got a relationship with them, it's going to give you way better answers than if it's just like looking at the internet.
Yeah, that brings in a level of complexity. And then let's say you're a director or VP of construction at a contractor, and that project managers are maybe not going to dive into this level of understanding AI or coding AI or making an agent, facilitating an agent. You want to have sort of like an across multi-regional construction firm functionality of like, okay, I want my PMs to be able to do the top 10 trades. Instead of taking 3 months to procure trade contractors, I want to be able to do that in like 10 days, right? So you can imagine that productivity and enhancements now, because now you can split project managers across jobs. That's the kind of real productivity bonuses you would get in doing this.
100%. I actually think that what you're likely to find in the next, year-ish is things that help PMs and replace some of what a PE does. You're still going to want a human. You're still going to want a PE, but a fair amount of what someone who's pretty junior does is the repetitive, go find me this information sort of thing. I see that as probably those two things, like as if the PM had an assistant, and actually as if the PE had an assistant. You know what I mean? Where you're pairing with it, and it gets to know, like, you load in what you need it to do, even if you don't do it all at once. Just like other software. In the beginning, it's useful, but the more you use it, you get comfortable with it, and you tune it the way you want, whatever that might mean. And I think you're going to see a lot of that. The other thing is, OpenAI has already done a lot to make it user friendly, so you don't have to really know the nuts and bolts, despite my spending an hour talking about it. But I think you're going to see more of that. I think you're going to see companies coming out with agents and bots that are already pretty good at something that you find useful, and then you can give it your specific information or connect it to your partners and so on. I think we're just beginning. The other thing I meant to say, and I usually say when I talk about this, is as contractors, as parts of this ecosystem in this industry, you have more agency than you think you do. In that this isn't just going to come and you have to deal with it. We get to say this is what you should go build, and if you build it, I would buy it, kind of thing. I think that there's more ability to steer this towards usefulness than we sometimes think, especially because it's moving so fast. It can feel like a wave that, oh my God, I hope we're okay. But you have more agency as a group than I think is always talked about. And I'd like people to know that they have more agency, and it's not just the weather.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not afraid of this thing at all. I mean, when it comes down to it, those that are on the projects, they make the rules.
Yeah.
It's going to be years for on a larger continuum for this to really become sort of common or accepted as normal practice within day-to-day activities. But can you just pull out your US and Canadian lexicon and tell me how you define what is a PE? Because I never heard of that.
The project engineer is the entry level in a general contractor.
Oh, so we call that a project coordinator, and
that's
yeah.
Yeah, they don't have to be engineers, which is a thing.
Yeah. So the greater fear is in 10, 20 years is it's not going to be project coordinators or project engineers anymore because of all this, because you're absolutely right. How we mentor PEs and PCs is by having them do mundane tasks that as a PM you don't want to do, or you've done it many times before. So at some point you're taking also some of the human learning that happens on these job sites when they come out of school.
Well, I would question that though, because first of all, that's happened a lot before. And I would say yes, but that's not the only way we learn. Doing boring, repetitive stuff isn't the only way humans can learn. And you now actually have in the AI a tutor that's with you all the time. So there are other ways that can often be more effective, where the AI can actually say what's going on right now and explain as if you had a tutor, right? Not a tutor, but on the job learning that's much more thoughtful than just remembering what happened over the course of 10 years. So I hear you, and that's a pretty common refrain in a number of industries. And I just don't think it's only that simple. It's a valid point, and I don't mean to dismiss it. But I do think we'll find two things happen. One is some things, especially in the skilled trades, we may do less of, like finding a stonemason who can do the things that an Italian stonemason can still kind of do is really hard in the US because no one does that anymore. So that I think your fear on that, especially again in the trades, is valid. But I think certainly for GCs, I think we'll find other ways to teach people, and maybe some of the skills that they don't learn, they don't need as much anymore.
Well, speaking from a PM perspective, and I'm 55 now, like I'm actually enjoying this where I don't have to, potentially there's a future where I wouldn't have to mentor or train or be reliant on or become a subject to other people's mistakes or lack of due diligence and lack of wanting to dive into detail. I can't tell you the amount of frustrations of having to bring people in, early or just fresh out of school into like, what does it mean to do your work diligently and to a high level of performance and precision? So
yeah, totally. I know. Wouldn't it be? I mean, I think it'll instead of that, it'll be AI that does things blindly, and you're like, oh my God, it did that thing again. But
yeah. Anyways, it's
so
great. I don't want to take the wind out of
bucks.
everybody else who has questions here.
I think Alper had something you wanted to talk about.
Hey, yeah, so many great points. And to that last conversation, I do hear that people are afraid of AI taking their jobs, but I do actually see it as a job enhancer. Like, I think I read somewhere 60% of today's job titles didn't exist before World War II.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's like a major fear, but I can totally see where people are coming from. Anyway, so I just wanted to bring up one thing. I am actually building an agent right now, which kind of works in between Procore and Outlook. I'm already integrated to Procore, and I used to be a PM. So my day-to-day job was, send out RFIs, submittal, answer simple emails, keep track of open items. So now, AI can do that automatically, which is amazing. And I'm very excited about it. And to everything you said, I just wanted to say, like, I think one indirect value that these agents will add is to capture more information. Because normally because Procore is such a hassle to like send out an RFI when you're in the field, you see something, you just pick up the phone and call your mechanical engineer and ask about the duct size, right? Whereas now, if you can just speak to my app, it's so easy. I can just convert your prompt to an RFI, and this way we capture that information. Now everyone knows about it, and discrepancies don't happen as often. So this presentation was very, very good. I just wanted to like add my point to it, to the like capturing of analog information in a way.
Love that. And if you reach out, if you've got the agent in a place where you're want to show it off, maybe one of these in a future one we'll show people.
100%. Yeah. The MVP should come out roughly in a month. It already does a lot, but when I show it, I want to make sure that it's pretty good.
Got to sing. I get it. Yeah. That's awesome. Interestingly, Matthew mentioned something, by the way, about how the ATM created more jobs than it replaced. It's a really interesting point. Speaking of Canada, coming out of University of Toronto is a fantastic economist, Ajay Agrawal, who wrote a book called Prediction Machines. And he talks about, I don't think he talks about exactly this, but he talks about the underlying idea. And that is, if something that you use, a tool that you use becomes really cheap, you become more expensive because it lowers the overall cost of whatever the work is. And ATMs, it turned out, everyone thought that was going to be the end. They were going to replace bank tellers, but it turned out that what ATMs do is the lowest value thing a bank teller does. And because they could actually charge, a dollar, whatever, for what an ATM does, it wound up and took that away from the high value work that a bank teller does. It wound up making the bank branches more profitable. So they had more bank branches, so they had more bank tellers. So Matthew, thank you for bringing that one up. I would encourage everyone to check out Prediction Machines, and they have another book that I seem to never remember, but really, really good work.
What's the author from Prediction Machine?
Yeah, so it's Ajay Agrawal. If you go look for him, he's not the only author, but I just always remember him because he did their first book tour. Oh, hang on, I don't know why it's doing that. Hold on one sec. Meeting group chat.
And Alper, I'd love to hear about the work you're doing with the chatbots and agents for doing Procore and Microsoft.
Yeah, for sure. I can drop my link. It's just a landing page, but if you can just put in your email when the product is out, I'll definitely reach out to you.
And Hugh and Alper, what's the best place to see you guys often? Is it Twitter, LinkedIn?
I'm on LinkedIn all the time. I don't spend a lot of time on Twitter or X.
Same here. LinkedIn.
I'm not cool enough.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, folks, thank you all for joining. We'll do another one of these, certainly at the end of February, and hopefully one or two in between. So thank you all for joining. You'll be able to, if you Google my name or YouTube, search my name, I'll have posted this. I'm going to edit a little bit, but I'll have posted this by tomorrow. You guys can check out anytime. So thanks, everybody.
Hey, Hugh, thanks also.
Thank you.
All right. Talk to you later.
Thanks, Isaac. It's good.
No, I'm just making sure you guys can grab it.